take out that photo album of some of the most wonderful days of your life and the travels that you've gone to, because that is also a true account of our world. You did take that journey to somewhere magical, and you took a picture of yourself and your family there. And you made a wedding for this child, or this child was bar mitzvahed, or here's your wedding album. That's just as real. That's just as real. And you mentioned these small moments. There are also big moments that are just as real. So when you think about, we talked about Kohelet, those 7 clusters of happiness that Kohelet expresses, it's about joy in eating and drinking. Often that happens right after an act of major injustice that's observed. That's not in our control. But what is in our control are these faith deposits that you can make in humanity and that you can also cherish when someone gives them to you.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is The Orthodox Conundrum. This is The Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. Every time I speak with Dr. Erica Brown, I come away enriched by her deep thinking and religious and emotional sensitivity. And this conversation, which delves into psychological and theological questions surrounding anxiety, hope, gratitude, and faith, may be our most memorable discussion yet. The Thanksgiving holiday takes place later this week in the United States, and 3 days later, Erica's newest book, Morning Has Broken, Faith After October 7th, will be released. Those 2 events, along with the continued fighting in Gaza and Lebanon and on other fronts, were the impetus for what I found to be a deeply moving conversation. We talked about how to deal with despair, finding hope in the midst of tragedy, the idea of faith deposits, how grief and pain are sometimes the price of love, learning how to acknowledge God in good times, just as we sometimes question where He is when things are difficult, and the difference between optimism and hope. We also talked about having faith in people as well as God, the ways that Israelis and Jews living outside of Israel often misunderstand each other, the pitfalls of unity and why its absence can lead to anger, and much more. I'm so honored that Erica agreed to be a guest on the podcast again, and I'm sure that you'll find this interview to be emotionally resonant as I did. We'll get to our conversation in just a moment. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, in 2024, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast. And JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Dr. Erica Brown is the Vice Provost for Values and Leadership at Yeshiva University and the founding director of its Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs Herenstein Center for Values and Leadership. She previously served as the director of the Mayberg Center for Jewish Education and Leadership at the George Washington University and as a scholar in residence for the Combined Jewish Philanthropies of Boston and the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington. Erica was a Jerusalem Fellow, an Avichai Fellow, the recipient of the 2009 Covenant Award, and is a faculty member of the Wexner Foundation. She has written or co-authored 16 books on the Hebrew Bible, spirituality, and leadership, and has been published in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Tablet, First Things, and the Jewish Review of Books. She wrote a monthly column for the New York Jewish Week, and is a consulting editor for the journal Tradition. Her latest book is Morning Has Broken, Faith After October 7th, which will be published on December 1st. She currently serves as a community scholar for Congregation Eitz Chaim in Livingston, New Jersey. Erica has interviewed Isaac Herzog, the President of Israel, Madeleine Albright, David Brooks, Jeffrey Goldberg, Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt, David Gregory, Dennis Ross, David Mykovsky, Sarah Hurwitz, Ruth Messinger, and Dara Horn, among others. She tweeted on one page of Talmud Study a Day at Dr. Erica Brown. She is the proud mother of 4 children, 4 in-law children, and 5 grandchildren. Dr. Erica Brown, thank you once again for joining me on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Oh, it's a delight to be here. It's always a fruitful conversation, and I feel very privileged to spend this time with you.
As do I. Erica, let me open up with a personal story. And I'm actually loath in general to talk too personally about my emotions, but I'm going to share them today because that's the nature of our conversation. This is not an exciting or big story, but it's something that happened when I was talking to somebody that I know in August, someone who lives outside of Israel, a religious person, and she mentioned that she was so happy about something, whatever that particular thing was. Now, that's okay. But at that moment when she said that, it didn't quite trigger me. But I did think to myself, that's really interesting. The words "I'm so happy" are not words that I can imagine using now or at any point after October 7th. And what was true during that conversation in August is still true now that we're speaking in November. I'm not trying to say that I have it chas v'shalom worse than anybody else. I don't, not at all. But the events that we've gone through over the past 13, 14 months have been so seismic and difficult and traumatic. Just living through a type of experience that we didn't expect, that we couldn't have expected, that we didn't think was even possible, has just changed the way, at least for me, I see the world and the way I look at hope, the way I think of what's coming in the future, the way that I anticipate things. Let me also be clear, Erica, I don't mean that I don't smile. Of course I do. I laugh, I have fun. But that deep existential happiness, which may be reading too much into what that person meant, but that concept of happiness is something which is very difficult for me to think about now in a real way. I wanted to throw that out sort of as an opening to a larger conversation.
Yeah, I think you make an excellent point. Even a basic how we greet each other says a lot about what people's internal states are. And so I want to share a few observations. I saw a woman in the supermarket many years ago who had lost a child. She had lost a son. It was totally unexpected. And he was 21. And I saw her some months later, and I did what I always do in a supermarket when you see someone you know. You say, "Hi, how are you?" And she just continued with her shopping cart straight by. And she sent me an email and she apologized. And she said, "I just don't know how to answer the question, 'How are you?' You don't want to hear how I really am." The fact is, I did want to hear how she really was, but I appreciate the fact that she was true to her feelings, and also that she caught herself and said, I feel that tragedy has made me an impolite person because I can't give answers that are not deep answers. And I recall reading something in C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed, which has always struck me, and I included in the book that I've just written, which we'll talk about, where he loses the love of his life. He married late, and he married a woman who was dying of cancer. So their marriage was very short-lived, but very attached and committed. And he said, I'm going to write about this because he was a writer, but I'm just going to use all the notebooks in my house. I'm not going to buy any more paper. I'll just use up the paper that I have in my house. So who knows what else he would have written had he gone out and purchased new notebooks. And he describes thinking ill of people who were laughing or saying, it's like, why should I shave? What meaning does it have to shave? What do I care about what someone else thinks? And so I think that there's one piece of this, which is how do you honor people who don't know how to answer the question, "How are you?" And at the same time, how do you, when you're in a state of despair, not rob other people of the joy they deserve? I spoke with a friend who's making a wedding here in the United States who felt terrible about making a wedding in this time period. And she spoke with an Israeli friend of hers, or perhaps a relative, who said, "I want you to make a very large wedding because I have been to very large funerals." So I think we as a Jewish people, we dance between these emotions of joy and sorrow, and we honor them. We honor them halachically, right? By saying, okay, there are laws of aninut, there are laws of the day of the loss, of the week of the loss, of the month of the loss, of the year of the loss, and every subsequent year, because we're giving mourning its due. And we do the same thing halachically with the laws of weddings, right? There are laws that are specific to each of those time periods, less so on the anniversary. But the idea of understanding that emotion lingers and emotion changes, and we recalibrate ourselves in relation to it. I think what we're seeing today is prolonged despair. How do you manage prolonged despair? And when people are overly positive, you think, are you not reading the news? Do you not know what's happening? Do you not see the number 400? And I want to make a disclaimer because we're having this conversation, and my children and your children are in a very different place. And so it would be unfair for me and disingenuous because I'm not living in Israel right now. I've traveled to Israel 4 times last year. I'll be going again in December and again in the spring, summer. But I'm not, I lived through the Gulf War and the first Intifada and the second Intifada in Israel. I saw the pain, but I'm not experiencing it. So I have a memory of it, but I'm not living with this level of anguish. So I want to also just make that disclaimer.
There are a lot of important points you made now, Erica. I want to talk about something that you said when you said that we shouldn't rob them of the joy they deserve when that person in Israel mentioned to your friend who was making a wedding that you should have a large wedding because we've had large funerals. I respect that. And I also don't understand it because when you talk about the joy we deserve, at times, one thing which has been a constant struggle for me and my wife, Eliza, that we discuss all the time, and I think for many people in Israel, is that exact disconnect between Jews living in Israel and Jews living outside of Israel. I think for a lot of people, there is an inability to understand each other. I'm speaking in both directions. I have said publicly to people in my family and to friends that I think that many Jews in America say and mean that I think about Israel and what's going on all the time. I'm obsessed with it. And I say, yeah, and you still don't get it. And there's something about the way you're thinking, you don't get it. And sometimes those same people will say about me that, no, you don't get it. You don't understand what it's like to be a Jew in America, not being able to be in Israel. And that lack of communication is very difficult for me. I don't really know what it's like, obviously, to be a Jew in America with family in Israel. And I don't necessarily always, and this is unfair of me, but respect that idea of, oh, we care deeply about Israel. And I can't help but emotionally think to myself, do you? Really? I don't think you know what it's like. I don't think you know what it's like to have a kid in the army. I don't think you know what it's like to have neighbors whose kids were killed. It's very, very difficult to think that way because it's not fair. They shouldn't have to think that way. They do deserve joy. I guess I have a hard time trying to put those things together to say, yes, you deserve joy and you should enjoy yourself and you should have fun. And sometimes I think to myself, of course they should, intellectually, but emotionally, I'm not necessarily there.
Yeah, and and that's why I made the disclaimer, and I actually meant to make it right off the bat, um, because I'm not experiencing what you're experiencing. When you think about Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, and he talks about pain, and he says when someone says to you, "I'm in pain," and you say, "Oh, like let's say you had a root canal, that's painful." I don't know if you've ever had. I had my gallbladder out, so that's painful. And someone says, "Oh, I had my gallbladder out. Oh, I had like I had a cavity, right?" And you think to yourself, it should be the same because it's the same procedure, but we're not the same people. We have different thresholds of pain. And this was something I struggled with in the book that I wrote, which I want to explain part of why I wrote it. There are people who are deeply feeling people, and in some way, there's an ocean between us, an ocean of tears between us. But there are people who feel things deeply on both sides, and there are people who are not feeling on both sides, right? So I think we would make a mistake to say if you haven't been in this circumstance, there's nothing to say about it. I'll give you, maybe a simpler example, not simpler, but we talked about a parent who loses a child. You could say someone shows up at your shiva, you lost a child, someone shows up to the shiva and says, "I'm so, so sorry for you." Now you can say, "I really appreciate this sort of you showing up, you being present, you being silent and honoring my silence, or honoring my emotions, or taking care of me by sending me food." Or you could say, "How dare you come here? You don't know what I am experiencing." So I'm saying in terms of creating community, I actually think there's work to do on both sides. And I think it hurts diaspora Jewry when the feeling is no matter what you contribute, no matter how many times you visit, no matter if you're not here and you're not serving, then you're not worthy. And I spoke to a friend of mine, and I included this in the book, but I'll just paraphrase it. And I spoke about my own guilt as an Israeli citizen and as an Israeli who had all of my children are citizens who are not serving, to someone who's has many sons serving. And I said, I just feel so guilty, and I just want to talk to you about it. And he said, it's interesting because one of my sons who's serving in the North feels guilty he wasn't serving in the South. And then later, the son who's serving in the South felt guilty he wasn't serving in the North. And the one whose friend got wounded feels bad because he wasn't wounded. And the one whose friend died felt bad. I think there's all this level of feeling bad. And the question is it just resulting in more anguish? Or is it, or in some way, can we transition that, not in a Pollyannish way, but to the transformative mechanisms of true discomfort, which help us say, we need to think about the leadership of the countries differently. We need to think about the direction that we're going. We need to think about Jewish unity in a different way. Can I only be close to you, Scott, if I'm going through the same experience as you? I'm not going to be able to, right? Thomas Nagel the philosopher, wrote a famous essay, what it's like to be a bat. And he's like, you can hang from the rafters, you can wear black, you can hang there in the middle of the night, but you're not going to be a bat. And so my experience is never going to be your experience. And I don't have to be a different, type of species. I'm just another person.
That's very interesting. Let's talk about that transition, though. How do we affect that transition? How do we allow ourselves to go from that mutual disconnect that I mentioned before? And I say it again, I want to give the same kind of disclaimer I mentioned before. I don't want to chas v'shalom pretend that I have it worse than any of 9 million other Israelis. That's not what I mean at all. I'm mentioning it only because I think that the feelings that I have are relatively universal among many Israelis, if not all Israelis. And alongside that, I also am fully aware that I'm being unfair, that I can't impose my emotions on somebody else, and I can't assume that other people's emotions aren't legitimate or are somehow shallow. That's not true. Every person has to deal with his or her own emotional universe. And at the same time, as we say, it's almost impossible to bridge that. So how do I move into that? If I can never be that bat just because I'm hanging upside down, no matter how much I'm trying, how do I relate to the other? How do I relate to our Jewish brothers and sisters in Israel or in the United States, for that matter, who feel differently than I do?
So I think there's an important conversation here about the quality of listening that people do, right? It's just, and it's interesting, as many times as I reach out to friends in Israel and relatives in Israel, there's raging anti-Semitism here. And I can't say that anyone has reached out to me from there, which I find very interesting. And again, is it because we're in the suffering Olympics? Because I don't want to play that game. It's the anniversary of Kristallnacht, and the only kosher restaurant in DC just had its windows smashed. Is that the same thing as dying in Gaza? It's not the same thing. Does it mean that you start internalizing the hate that other people are expressing towards you, and you feel a state of non-belonging, no matter how meaningful or how much impact you're having here? And so I think there's a sense, there can be a selfish sense that I'm in a dramatic moment and you're not, and you're not entitled to have feelings. And I want to compare it to many years ago, I lost a very, very close friend. I think about all the time. And when her family was sitting Shiva, I felt like I should sit Shiva with them. Right. And I think a lot of people did, because she had beautiful friendships that she really cultivated and invested in. And so I wrote an article about, sort of the empty chair at Shiva, which is occupied by the friends you have. And sometimes those friends, as we know, the friends are the family that we choose. And so there's no category. But I want to grieve and I want to mourn, and I'm just not in that category. So what do I do that can honor the grief that I have and channel it into something constructive, by honoring where the family is and also creating a space where we can discuss what we're deeply feeling. In the beginning of this war, Scott, I thought, wow, we have come together as an and it's been unbelievable. And I remember getting to Israel, and it was empty. Ben Gurion was empty. It was 2 weeks after the war started. I wanted to go. Someone came in my office, told me about a trip that he was going on. I said, "Can I go?" And 5 minutes later, I was on the trip. Right? I just called. I was like, "I need to be there." And someone who was working in the airport just came over and gave me a hug, and Toda Shabbat, thank you so much for coming. And I felt like, thank you so much for being here, thank you for staying. I didn't even know what to do with myself, sort of finding the words. And that was very powerful. And now I think we're in a different stage. There's a lot of resentment. There's a lot of anger. There's anger at the Haredi population for not doing their time. There's anger at the government. There's anger at, anger goes everywhere. Resentment goes everywhere. And then it also goes out to people who are saying, I care about you and I love you. But if you're not having my experience, how dare you love? And that I think is problematic. And I don't, and I think we have to think about what that, what to do with those feelings.
I think it has transformed into that anger, that original sense. In fact, I think they're related. The fact that we had that giant sense of unity and it didn't turn into what we hoped it might have turned into. For example, it wasn't that the Haredim started enlisting en masse. That didn't happen. People didn't start making Aliyah en masse. People made Aliyah, but not perhaps to the degree we thought. That feeling of unity became the impetus for some of the anger that exists now, I think, because it felt so good and it felt like there was a sea change. And we look around us and say, has there really been a sea change? Has anything actually changed in our relationships? I wonder if part of the source of the anger is this feeling of we got so close, it felt like we were onto some new sense of unity and it didn't pan out the way we had hoped. And that's part of my own question about the definition of unity. And one of the things that bothers me is it's very hard to know what real unity is. For some people, unity means that everybody agrees. So therefore, if you protest against the government, you are violating the spirit of unity. If you don't protest against the government, you're violating the spirit of unity. This idea of unity is everybody thinks exactly the same thing, groupthink. That's not unity to me. That's fascism. Or perhaps I should better say that's a form of unity, but it's not a good form of unity. It's a very bad form of unity. It's the kind of unity that's imposed by dictatorial regimes. On the other hand, the idea that anyone can say anything, well, that's not unity either. There's certain ideas. If someone says, I am against the state of Israel and I believe that Israel shouldn't exist, I'm not going to say, okay, your opinion is your opinion. That's a valid opinion. Or lahavdil, on a much more mundane level, when people in the Haredi community would argue that, well, we have our way of looking at things, which is we should not serve in the army for whatever reason, and you have your way of looking, and we can both live together with that. I'm not quite sure that's true. There are certain things that are out of bounds. And in my opinion, that's a chilul Hashem. That's something which is a desecration of the divine name and a serious violation of halacha and values of the Torah. So for me to say, yeah, that's fine, that's not true either. Unity is a very difficult nut to crack exactly what it is that we want when we say we want unity.
Well, I think also there are consequences of the way that we think and express ourselves in the world. So the consequence of someone not serving is that someone else is going to have to serve and do second or third or fourth tours of Miluim, right? And I think that at that point, there's a certain sort of existential fatigue, right? And we talk about compassion fatigue, where people just give and give and give, and then the resentment builds, and the sense of who else is carrying this with me. There's a great, I think it's a Rav Nachman story where a king, because there's always a king in these stories, and a king has a son, because there's always a son in these stories. And he says, I want you to be the ruler, but I need to know if you can rule. So I'm going to give you a test. And the test is, can you take this stone and can you put this stone in the attic? And here's the ladder. And he's thinking and thinking and trying and budging and moving, and he just can't get it up the ladder. It's just not going to get up there. And he fails. And the king realizes that his son will never be king. And his son implores him to tell him, how does this happen? And he said, I didn't tell you that you have to carry the whole thing up on your own. You have to break this big stone into a lot of pieces, and everyone has to carry some pieces and carry them up. And the imagery also of raising the pain, not carrying the pain alone, but raising the pain. And I do think I've seen among the most committed Zionists who live, at least in the United States and in the UK and Australia and South Africa, other English-speaking countries that I've been in communication with, that people are carrying the pain. They're now, they've moved from sending, equipment and other basic needs to supporting mental health infrastructure in Israel, because there's just so much to do. And I think people are looking for direction in how to express and how to mitigate some of the anger. There's a philosopher whose name I just can't recall for the moment, and he wrote about community and why we use the term community. And he said, on the negative side of this, sometimes we use community to mask the real divisions that exist within society. So we say we are one, but actually we are fractured. And so how do you live in the fracture and live together in the fracture?
Erica, I want to ask you about hope, because that really is part of what I see as that which can overcome some of that despair and some of the fractures. If people are looking towards the same hope ultimately, the same ultimate goal perhaps. Once again, this is atypical for me. I don't usually reveal my own emotions, but I'll say that one thing I found difficult over the past year, even this past Friday. I was looking at an old video. Someone sent a video of one of my daughter's bat mitzvahs, something like that. And it was very, very sweet. It's very difficult for me to look at times when things were normal. When I think back to those times when things were normal and we had smachot, and of course we still have smachot. We do. But back then they felt different. Maybe I'll say there was a lot more hope and a lot less despair that was underlying those smachot. Whereas now there are all sorts of other things happening at the same time. And it's very difficult for me to look back at those times and think that was back when there was hope. It's a very painful experience to do so. How do you relate prolonged despair to this lack or loss of hope, and how can we regain hope?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had the magic formula for that. I think it'd be wonderful if we could bottle up something that could help us in times of despair. So if you think of when you pass by a fire extinguisher and it's behind glass and it says, in case of a fire, and you say, yeah, but right now the world is burning. In case of a fire, what am I taking out? And some of that, by the way, I think that there are medicinal that there's real depression and that there are medications to take for depression and that there are therapies that people should use, cognitive behavioral therapeutic techniques and seeing a therapist and not being afraid to do that because we have to take care of ourselves. We've talked about Kohelet together, Scott. We had such an enriching conversation about it, and it's a book that I keep going back to over the course of the war, and specifically the time poem, right? Of Eight Their Code, right? It's like the idea is like Eight Lispod, Eight Their Code. There's a time to dance, there's a time to grieve, there's a time for war, there's a time for peace, and you want to say, no, there's only a time for peace. There's only a time to dance. There's only the time, and what you hear in the book is we're going to go through these cycles. But I want to assure you that the pendulum swings. It doesn't swing instantly back. In fact, if it swung back instantly, it would feel inauthentic. And I'll just say as someone who I could not dance this Simchat Torah. I think a yeoman's effort was made to create spaces and honor death and memory, to give people that sort of release valve. But I just couldn't go there. I was never a person who found it easy to go from Yom HaZikaron to Yom HaAtzmaut in Israel or in Chutz La'aretz. I couldn't make that transition easily. I'm a very feeling person. And I pay a price for that, for feeling deeply. And sometimes the intensity of it is too much. And I do want to say, I spoke to many, many people, writers, teachers, rabbis, friends on both sides of the ocean who are in this prolonged season of despair, and they feel that they're on a mission, right? I've got to educate people. I've got to teach people. I've got to write about the situation. And what they're doing is they're in this constant state of depletion. And when I suggested, what would a break look like right now? What would nourish you right now? What music could you play? A playlist, right? And I want to talk about the role of music in this. And the initial reaction is always the same. But if I did that, I would be betraying people who are, serving right now, or the parents who are mourning right now. And you're saying, right, but we need you to be strong. You're leading. We need you to be strong. And we need you to know that range of emotions is still there, that intense happiness, intense grief, they're connected. And when you feel things, I think we're all going through as a community this like wave of feeling of unity. And then remember all the pictures we were showing of people who are protesting the judicial reform and both sides are volunteering, and you're going, wow, I wish I were in that part of the war. And we're not there.
Yeah. It's interesting when you say that's the price we pay, that people who feel deeply, the price you pay is that it's very difficult sometimes to get out of that. I believe you said it before, Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis. There was a movie about his love with this actual Jewish woman, and it starred him, Anthony Hopkins, and Deborah Winger from, I think, 1994, something like that, called Shadowlands, something like that. And one of the major themes is that's the deal. The intense love comes with intense grief. The price of that intense love is that it does eventually have to lead to that kind of grief.
Right. So just to sort of think about not only the swings, but life life swings, right? So when you think about dramatic adolescent years, I don't know if you had them, Scott. I definitely had them. Where you sort of you look in the mirror and you think, no one else understands me. And it's not that people don't understand you, it's that you haven't actually articulated your emotions in a way to someone else, and you almost don't want someone else to be in the same place because it takes away from the uniqueness of your own emotions. Um, and that's why we have support groups, frankly, right? So that we have people. I've done, I've done a lot of research on death for the book I wrote, Happier Endings. And it was interesting to speak to people who knew they were dying. They were dying of an illness, a terminal illness, and they could not speak to anyone in their family because they didn't want to rob them of their joy, especially if they felt that they wouldn't understand. But what happened is it created this deep barrier. And part of it was saying, what if you could segment out what you talked about with different populations? So because your family is so afraid of you dying, they don't want to have that conversation. You're not having it, but you are having it in your support group where everyone has the same illness that you're having. And I use these because I think these are parallel. They're individual microcosms of the macrocosm of a society that's in pain. We have been historically in pain for years, right? You think of the Shoah. I think of the years my grandparents spent in concentration camps, the years my mother spent in an orphanage, right? And it was it's impossible to imagine. But they were people who went back to a baseline of happiness. And we do have a lot of psychological research on baselines of happiness when people say, I will never smile again. And then you see them smiling a few years later as they gradually rebuild.
I think what you mentioned before about what music, what playlist would be helpful to you, it's not just music, even though I think that's a big part of it, but in general, sometimes the small pleasures in life, even though they're small and unimportant, they don't really matter, somehow they bring you into, at least in my own very limited experience, bring you back into a place of being able to enabling you to handle it. In case of emergency, you mentioned a fire extinguisher, but sometimes I think behind that glass might be a cup of coffee. My father died 7 months ago, and at the time, it was a very intense Shiva. It was a very normal Shiva, like anyone who loses a parent. And when I think about that Shiva, I think of a lot of things, including it was very, very good coffee. And it's a funny thing to think about, but it actually was a part of that overall experience, the normal part. And I think that what you're referring to might in some way reflect that.
Yeah, actually, there's this. I wish I could cite it, precisely, and its author. But I was reading a book, and there's this quote where a person is falling apart, and everything in his life is falling apart, and he physically just drops down to the floor. And when he's at the floor, he notices that there's some paint missing from the molding, right? Because because we're still human, and so you can have these experiences and you're thinking about grief and then someone comes in to Shiva and you're going, right, those socks just totally don't match that guy's pants, right? And you're having this absurd because we live with the absurd, and there's something also where the absurdity actually saves us, right? The absurdity of it saves us because we say, oh, I can still care about things as banal as that. So I want to talk about music, but I also want to talk about the importance of conversation, and the importance of silence. And I think there are a lot of people who withdraw when they're in pain. That tends to be my initial reaction to things, is to withdraw. I think you have to decide, who do you have a conversation with when you're in pain? Because if you just have it willy-nilly with here's a person who's in my eyesight right now, but that person doesn't have a language of feelings to the same vocabulary, the same lexicon of emotion, and then you get frustrated, and then you get to the you'll never understand me. But we've all gone through experiences of pain, and the older we get, the more loss we experience. I think Bruce Feiler's book, Life is in the Transitions, which is an expression of William James, it was really important for me. He talks about the fact that in your lifetime, you'll probably have every 18 to 36 months some transitional experience. That might be a job change, that might be a family loss, that might be the winning of the lottery. And he says, and probably 5 times within your lifetime. And this was, he sent, I think he had a research group of about 250 people who his team was doing qualitative interviews with. 5 times in your life, you'll have what he calls a life quake, a life quake. Now, as it happens, we've had multiple life quakes within a very short period of time. When you think of some of the world's great natural disasters, and 9/11, and you think of COVID, and we didn't get up from COVID, and then we had, right, the Ukraine war, and then now we're in a war in the Middle East, um, that hopefully will not escalate into something bigger. The political winds are shifting. We just came out of an election, a very contested election, lots of despair all around. And even with victory, there's despair. So, we're a country that's sort of, the sense is that we're falling apart, and how do you regain all of these things? We're gonna move out of that, because I believe you get to a point of despair, and then people say, oh, we've got to run for office. Oh, we've got to rebuild, the OTAF. Oh, we've got to, and then we invest our energies into something positive.
Then, Erica, that definitely relates to the connection between hope and faith. Can
Yeah.
you talk a little bit about how they relate to each other and how we deal with and build faith in the context of despair, to move from despair? Once again, as you said, there's no magic potion for it, but how do we build faith on the undercurrent of despair that exists?
Yeah. It's an important question, maybe one of the most important questions, certainly for religious Zionists, in Israel and worldwide, is what does emunah look like on day 400? We keep saying Tehillim. Sometimes it's the same verses again and again. Do they change their meaning, or do we get tired of saying them because we want to actualize? We want God to really hear the pain and do something about the pain. So I appreciate, and one of the things I tried to do in the book is look at the valleys, the troughs, the mountains, right? Like how we travel through faith experiences. And when you have this sort of minor victory, and you get like this little surge, right? It's almost like this little oxygen pump of feeling like we're near the end, or this could, we're strong, we're mighty, we could win this, or someone kind does something for us. And I want to talk a little bit about kindness from strangers, because I think that's part of what gives people faith. I went to have an x-ray, and I took off the x-ray technician, who was wearing a large cross, an African American man in the middle age, said to me, "You're going to have to take off your necklace, right? Bring them home." He says, "You have to take off that for the x-ray." So I took it off, and as I was taking it off, he says, "Don't worry, I'm wearing mine too." And he takes it out. He takes out the same necklace that I'm wearing under his cross. Um, or, the friend who calls me, a non-Jewish colleague, and she leaves a message, and her message is, "Tell me what you're praying for right now so I can pray for the same thing." And then you see these like pockets of people, and you just say, I'm going to actually linger in the kindness of that, because it bolsters my faith in humanity. And I do want to say, I think it's an important distinction between faith in God, which also, waves and wavers and strengthens, and faith in humanity. And I think that's what suffered the most, I think, is our belief in others. How is it that hooligans attacked Israeli sports fans and the police did nothing? How is that?
I really do relate to that, Erica. Some of the most positive, surprising moments I've had over the past year have been interactions in person or over email or over social media with people who deeply cared. That's been an amazing experience. Sometimes we're surprised by how much we can feel despair, but we've been echoing C.S. Lewis. He wrote a book called Surprised by Joy. Perhaps we can say surprised by faith in others, surprised by kindness, surprised by people not letting you down, by people really seeming to care and reaching out and saying, people who I know just by email, who will write to me and say, "I just want you to know that I'm thinking about you and hoping it all is okay. And by the way, I try to do the same to them. I don't pretend that they should reach out to me and I shouldn't reach out to them, make sure they're doing okay." This is something which we can create a mutual type of relationship of faith in each other, which in turn, I think, helps us develop a greater sense of faith in that which is beyond us as well.
Yeah, and I want to use a term that I wish we would adopt. Faith deposits. All right. We tend to think of faith as sort of static. If you have emunah, you have emunah. But in every relationship we go through these sort of cycles of intimacy and distance. And what I mean a faith deposit is, what do you do with all of those good faith moments where someone especially strangers, right? The kindness of strangers. And you experience the kindness of strangers, and then you say, I'm putting this as a bank deposit. I'm actually going to write it down. I'm going to write it down, and it's going to be a deposit. I have I don't know about you, I think I've mentioned this before, that I have two categories of emails, right? In my personal and my professional. I have the kindness emails, and I have the horrible emails, right? And I save them. I save them. We can have a whole conversation about why I save them, but I will say that it's important that there are two kinds of deposits, right? And that you're aware of how many deposits you are actually making in someone else's faith account. Have I strengthened people's faith in humanity through my friendship, through my kindness, through, the little things that make such a difference. The little note that you send by hand to someone to say how much you were touched by something that they end up saving. It was all those little deposits. They give people strength for the hard days. They're not going to take away the large battlefield that we're on. And at the same time, they give us a reason to wake up in the morning. And then that's true for music, right? The experience of music, which I want to go back to. Music, I think, is another faith deposit because you hear someone sing beautiful lyrics and you're reminded, I was I was deeply in romantic love. Or, yes, I did feel that when I looked at my child's face for the first time. And yes, I'm going to actually, I just want to make a suggestion to our listeners is take out that photo album of some of the most wonderful days of your life and the travels that you've gone to, because that is also a true account of our world. You did take that journey to somewhere magical, and you took a picture of yourself and your family there. And you made a wedding for this child, or this child was bar mitzvahed, or here's your wedding album. That's just as real. That's just as real. And you mentioned these small moments. There are also big moments that are just as real. So when you think about, we talked about Kohelet, those 7 clusters of happiness that Kohelet expresses, it's about joy with one's, joy in eating and drinking. Often that happens right after an act of major injustice that's observed. That's not in our control. But what is in our control are these faith deposits that you can make in humanity and that you can also cherish when someone gives them to you.
What you're saying right now is helping me, as you're saying it, reframe what we talked about a few moments ago when I talked about the difficulty in seeing wonderful moments in life and thinking, wow, back then there was nothing to worry about. Back then it was all hope and enjoyment, and now it feels like sometimes that's not part of life. What you're saying is look at life as a continuum. Look at that as part of the existence of life, almost in the Kohelet sense. There's a time to dance and a time to weep, and there's time for good and bad. And that still exists. Not to look at it as, oh, that was in the past and now everything is just dark. But that's part of the continuum of lifetime, and it existed. It didn't go away, so to speak.
Yeah, it didn't go away. And I began writing about the war when I, in the first 2 weeks that I was there. And that's just really because that's my natural response as a writer is you process the way that you process. And then seeing, sort of tracing the different ways in which the war was evolving from here and from there, and also realizing that as the war prolonged, Israelis were having a different experience than Americans were, certainly Americans on college campuses were, and that in some way I felt that Israelis could easily invalidate the experiences that many Americans were having. And so I gave the book to readers as I continued writing it. And as I was editing it myself and reading it, we went through all these different experiences in the war. We tend to think that the most recent experience that we have, the most recent emotion we have, is the way we've always felt, and that's not necessarily the case. So being able to also, look at this, the book One Day in October that Toby Press has published, Cohen, it's, and there are people who said I bought the book, but I'll never read it, or I can't read it right now, and I will say I understand that. I read it on Tisha B'Av. That's what I read. In addition to Keynote, I just read the whole book that day, and it made me actually realize what lions are fighting this war, what heroes we have of every dimension. So if you're saying, I'm not going to read this, I think you're doing yourself a disservice. You're dishonoring your own feelings, and you're also preventing yourself from experiencing the genuine feelings that other people have, and the contributions that other people make.
Erica, let's talk a little bit about that book. Originally, it was entitled Staying Human, and you and I talked about it close to a year ago. You subsequently expanded it, and it's going to be released on December 1st, I believe. It's entitled Morning Has Broken, Faith After October 7th. First, I'd like to know, what did the first book lack that you wanted to expand it?
Yeah, I wrote the first book till about Hanukkah time. And then we put it as in a digitalized format in Koren. But of course, the war didn't end. I mean, I think all of us thought, Hanukkah, wouldn't this be amazing, right? Remember when Roland was, was giving donuts to everybody? We were thinking like, the Maccabees and it didn't end. And then I stopped writing for a while, and then I just said, I'm processing this, and I kept going. And then the question was, what, like, when do you stop? And also as a writer, you're trying to capture the depth of the experience. So I myself was going through a lot of darkness in the writing of it. And I was like, I need to take a break from this. But then I felt like, who am I to take a break from it? No one on the front line is taking a break from it. So we're all sort of on the front lines of something. I mean, there's safety in being the front lines of a laptop, right? I wasn't kidding myself. So I kind of had a lot of mixed emotions about it. But as I was showing pieces of it to people, said, that's exactly what I feel, but I just didn't have language. And that made me feel like I probably should continue. And then I stopped after a year because I felt like there has, what's the stopping point? You can stop at the last day of the war. And or you're just sort of creating the cycle of what a war looks like. And and the again, those sort of troughs and mountains and valleys, and also using my own experience as a Jewish text teacher, as a Torah teacher. It's like, how is the Torah relating? Because as a friend and I were talking about it, everything that we've taught has been really through the lens of the war. Even if you don't intend it, you're teaching something else, but it was always creeping back to that. And how do you sort of document what an experience looks like when you go through it from a Torah perspective?
So I read Staying Human before it was expanded. As I mentioned to you at the time, it was one of the most powerful reading experiences I've had. It was really, really an intense emotional experience. You can feel your heart there, Erica. It's very, very clearly. I want to know, what else is in this book. Is it more of the same, or is there something fundamentally different going on after a 3-month writing process rather than turning into a year-long looking at a war? Does despair enter the picture? Does boredom at some point enter the picture? The same thing over and over? What happened over the course of the year?
Right. So that's, when you edit, you're also editing your emotions, right? You're editing your experiences, and you're saying, is this worthy? Do you cut this out? But this was a genuine experience. I didn't write this as a journalist, right? A journalist keeps writing because a journalist keeps experiencing the war. But I wrote this. It's the most personal book that I've ever written. So I think that's a little frightening, to make yourself vulnerable and talk about the darkest days. And when you feel you're at rock bottom in your emotions, in terms of whatever it is, guilt, despair, lack of optimism, physically feeling you're not yourself. And that was part of what I was trying to document, is and also speaking to my Israeli friends and relatives, is what they were experiencing, trying to document their sense that they physically weren't who they were, right? They couldn't even recall a time. So I think when you're 3 months in, it's very different than when you're 6 months in, or when you're 12 months in. There's a different sense of the leadership of the country, of the direction that you're going in, of why you're in a war in the first place, and also citing people who've written books on war. The book, The Culture of War, or Matzi Friedman's, Pumpkin Flowers. Reading. I did a lot of reading about war during the course of writing this, and also thought a lot about Zecher L'Chorban. We have a set of halachot of what we do to remember terrible things, and we memorialize them. We memorialize them at the table, right? There's an empty seat. We didn't invent the empty seat in this particular war. In fact, the way that in Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma bombings in the United States, the memorial there are empty. It's empty seats, right? And that's sort of a framework, and we've adopted that. But we're not the first to have the empty seat mentality. And you can look at it in halakha, leave an empty seat at the table. Don't wear your full set of jewels, whatever your full set of jewels looks like. I'm still waiting for mine. At the end of, and put up an amma by an amma, that your walls are some, and it's not that you're painting it on, it's that it's never been complete. And then, there's this just little snippet in the Mishnah Berurah as you're finishing your learning. It says, like, you're never going to experience simcha again in your life. So there'll always be a partial simcha. And for people who couldn't understand that, this war helped them understand that. Um, the loss of someone they love helps them understand that they're standing under a chuppah, but they're for a child, but they've lost a parent, and they realize my happiness is not complete. And I think that is a life lesson, is how to live with uncertainty and how to live with incomplete happiness. But there also has to be incomplete sadness, Scott, which is you can't fully be sad. When I look at my grandchildren, and it's such a blessing to have them, I that is a nechama. I can't fully be sad, because if I feel truly blessed, who am I to deny the gifts that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given me? We always say when the world is bad, where was God? And what we need to teach ourselves is when the world is good, there's God. There's the divine fragment. That's it.
I've always thought that one of the fundamental ideas that underlie Jewish thought is the fact that we live in what's called the Alma de Shikra, the world of falsehood, which is compared to Olam Haba, the world to come, which is called Olam HaEmet, the world of truth. And why is it a world of sheker, a world of falsehood? I believe that it's a world of falsehood because this is a world where everything is mixed together, where the good has evil in it and where the evil has good in it. In fact, some understand the whole idea of the Eitz Hadat and Bereshit, the tree of knowledge, as creating that mixture of good and evil at all times. A good example of this for me is the bracha of Hatov Metiv, the fourth bracha of Birkat Hamazon. This fourth bracha is considered our happiest bracha. And yet, what was the occasion on which it was composed? It was the fact that they were able to bury the dead of Beitar after effectively a genocide when the Romans destroyed the Jewish community in Israel. And miraculously, the bodies didn't decompose and they were able to get a proper Jewish burial. At first, they weren't allowed to bury them. Eventually, they were given permission to bury them and the bodies were still intact. So think about this. We had essentially another Holocaust, the destruction of sovereignty in Israel for many, many years. And that moment, the biggest tragedy that had afflicted the Jewish people in many years, was the time they found something good from which the greatest, most happy bracha that we have was composed.
Yeah, amazing. I actually want to throw something from a very different direction into this conversation. Kate Bowler wrote a book called Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved. And she is a professor, her specific area of study in divinity is the prosperity gospel. And then she got stage 4 breast cancer as a young person with a husband and a child. And here she is, studying a movement of people who believe, you do good and money is raining down and you are going to be successful. And now she's had this, and people would, come over to her and say, well, it's sort of the Job's friends, Eob's friends, well, it must be, for sins that you've done. And as a religious person, having to work through those things, or something that she identifies as at least, right? The at least. Well, at least you didn't suffer from this, right? And she get letters from people after she wrote a column in the New York Times about this, which led to her writing more than one book about this experience. You should get, well, at least you don't, honey, at least you didn't have this, right? And she's sort of like asking us to do a check. How often are we using at least as a comparison experience? Well, at least you didn't go through this. And I'm saying this because I remember having a conversation with a psychologist about suicide. And the grief, when I was writing my book on, I did a chapter on grief in my book, Happier Endings. And I spoke with a clinical psychologist about the experience of people who cannot grieve because they're so angry. And this very often happens after a suicide. There's other feelings that intercept. I feel guilty. I could have done more, or I'm so angry. Like, how could you have done this to me, to our family, to whatever, in whatever context? And then saying what you're doing is denying yourself the space to grieve and just be in that space of mourning. And I'm concerned that one thing that's breaking up the unity, that's the unity that I think we are at risk of losing across the diaspora and Israel, is when there's so much to mourn for, and yet there's so much to you can also blame. And so what you're seeing in Israel, there's so much anger, there's so much fire in the streets, And it's sort of the repressed grief turns into the anger outside so that you don't have to experience the loss inside. But you have to experience it, right? We try not to give people who are in grieving situations medication to minimize the grief, because then they can't actually deepen the joy on the other side of the tunnel. And Sherry Mandel wrote about this in The Blessings of a Broken Heart, right? About going to a funeral for her son, and people offering medication and her not taking it because she knew the tunnel of grief has a hole on the other side of it. But if I'm in the fog and I maintain the fog and I don't experience the grief, I'm not going to get to the other side of it. And that's sort of collectively, I'm pondering, I'm wondering about how we're going to manage that.
That's a very important point. I'm thinking about that now as you're speaking about it, how that anger can distract us from what we should be feeling. That's a lot for me to think about. I want to ask you a question about the title of your book, which is sort of a side point, but it made me think when I saw that it had been retitled, instead of Staying Human, Morning Has Broken, Faith After October 7th. Well, Morning Has Broken obviously echoes the Cat Stevens song. And Cat Stevens is someone who has been vocally anti-Israel,
Yeah.
both before and after October 7th. Just one example is, he said, I'm going to quote him right now. He said on Facebook, a post from April 1st, "Morning has broken. I don't think we can ever look at Israel the same again. People have finally woken up to the long years of injustice inflicted upon the Palestinian people. The media's complicit silence has now been shattered by the blaring arrival of social media. After morning must come midday, and that's when crimes against humanity must be accounted for." Obviously, your use of the term is not the same as his,
Right.
but I'm kind of curious why you used a term that he would use in a very different way, if that was deliberate.
Right. So a few things, and thank you for asking that question, and asking it, it's not an easy question to answer. Um, I thought a lot about Staying Human, and when I saw the cover, the initial cover, that said Staying Human, I looked at it and I said, there's no option. As we're not staying human, we are human. And the goal is, of course, you don't want to debase yourself and allow violence to carry the day. But I didn't want to assume. I thought it was too negative. I think we need to stay human. We are human. There's no choice. Make good choices that strengthen the dignity of the human condition. I thought a lot about, there's a chapter in the book about mourning, about the idea of there's always a morning, and the mizmor that we say, mishomrim laboker, shomrim laboker, right? And as we're always sort of the guardians, we're the watch people for the morning. I even wrote, like, Jews are a mourning people, right? And mourning in the sense of morning and mourning. We're mourning people, and looking at different places in Tanakh where the mourning is a state of relief or the mourning brings clarity. And so when I thought about it, obviously there's a Cat Stevens song with that name on it, but he didn't corner the market on mourning, on morning breaking. And so one of the sentences in the book is, morning has broken, morning, morning has broken, and then morning is broken, right? In other words, I think this was a morning attack. And in some way, every day is some reliving of October 7th. Every time someone says October 7th, the same way 9/11, the planes are going into the building, right? The barriers are being broken down. And that at the same time, every morning that we get up, we have choices to make about our humanity. And I wanted to recover the morning from it being a place of brokenness to being a place of wholeness. So I'm not troubled by the Cat Stevens, because Cat Stevens doesn't own the morning. I will say that I did include something from Ta-Nehisi Coates until actually the book was right before the printing stage. Observations he made in his magnificent book Between the World and Me about growing into consciousness around anti-Semitism. And then I took them out because of his book, The Message, which I read over Sukkot and was deeply, deeply disturbing. He's got a very aggressive, assertive, masculine voice where the intersectionality is not subtle. The condemnation, the 10 days that he spends in Palestine with no acknowledgement of October 7th, how someone who is reputedly a scholar can write so glibly about the situation was deeply distressing. And I said, even though I love this, I can't bear to put him in this book. He can't be in the book. So we excised him.
I have to say, though, regarding Morning is Broken and Cat Stevens, I actually think that that double entendre, so to speak, to me, it was actually very moving to think about how even the things that, at least this is how I took it, when I first heard that title for your book, thinking about even the things that we consider holy and good have sometimes been turned on their head by people who do not like us and people who are finding ways that even the things that we do that are good and that we believe are righteous are somehow turned into exemplars of evil. And in that way, using a term that for us might imply Shomrim Laboker, waiting for the dawn. And you did it as well by saying morning with a U and using the term that Cat Stevens used to say morning is broken. Now we're going to show Israel for what it really is. To me, was actually very moving and deep, actually, in a real way.
Thank you. I mean, I want to talk about the cover. I'm very grateful to the graphic artist at Koren because he spent a lot of time with me thinking about the cover. The letters are sort of broken, and there's a sense of the brokenness and sort of a watercolor effect. But that also allows the light in, and I think that's that's important and powerful.
Okay, Erica, we're almost finished, and we're recording this on November 10th, but we're releasing it the week of Thanksgiving in the United States, the week when we think about gratitude. When I was growing up, Thanksgiving was probably my favorite day of the year. You know, turkey and football, what's not to like?
Yeah. And you can heat the food and you don't have to like make it and then reheat it and then it dries out. It's and you can drive anywhere you like. You can
My
drive
mother
it.
says like a yontif without any halachas associated
Right.
with it,
Yeah,
with any
exactly.
prohibitions. So let's talk just for a moment before we finish about gratitude. We've spoken about despair, about hope, and about faith, but I think gratitude fits in there as well. How do we develop and engender that sense of gratitude, even in difficult times?
It's interesting. Last year on Thanksgiving, I wrote about this. I was in Israel for Thanksgiving, and I wrote about it was a in a blog post in the Times of Israel what to be grateful for despite the war, because I think again, wars bring out intensity of feelings, which means our gratitude we should experience with greater intensity. I'm very mindful of what that means. I want to just cite a spiritual writer, Melody Beattie, and something that I've thought about a lot. I came across this quote many years ago. She writes, gratitude unlocks the fullness of life. It turns what we have into enough and more. It turns denial into acceptance, chaos to order, confusion to clarity. It can turn a meal into a feast, a house into a home, a stranger into a friend. Gratitude makes sense of our past, brings peace for today, and creates a vision for tomorrow. Now, some of that feels a little maybe glib or trite, but I think this idea of gratitude unlocking the fullness of life, I always say that we're going to be fully human when the bow we make for Modim is deeper than the handrest, the armrest that we make for Tachanan, right? In other words, your body also speaks gratitude. Bow deeply for your Modim, right? And it was be totally in that space, right? That space that captures what it is that we still have, right? What it is that we still are grateful for. And I think times of war should unleash the real depth, the sort of fierceness of gratitude, as opposed to the just simple thank you of going into detail about what we're grateful for. And I've been at Thanksgiving tables where the conversation was about whether the turkey is dry or moist. And I've been to Thanksgiving tables here and around the world where people had conversations like, this has been a hard year for our family. Let's talk about what we have, what we still have, what we'll always have. And those have been, and all of a sudden, whatever food there is, you're just transcending the food because you're in the depth of feeling. I also, you mentioned hope before, and I would be remiss if I didn't cite something from Rabbi Sachs that we actually have on our walls at the Sachs Center, in Sachs Herenstein Center at Yeshiva University. Optimism and hope aren't the same. Optimism is the belief that the world is changing for the better. Hope is the belief that together we can make the world better. Optimism is a passive virtue. Hope is an active one. It needs no courage to be an optimist, but it takes a great deal of courage to hope. And I think hope and gratitude are deeply linked. I worry that with prolonged despair, anger, resentment, guilt, all those negative emotions and their intensity, that we actually are blocking off the other emotions that are still part of the human condition. And without them, life would truly not be meaningful or worthwhile.
Erica, speaking to you today, as always, is a deeply moving experience for me, and I'm very, very grateful that you joined me today. I always enjoy talking to you and get so much out of it, as I'm sure my listeners do as well. Let's all hope that we can move into that direction of hope, moving away from pure optimism into trying to make things better, trying to be an active participant in making things better, moving away from despair into gratitude, and being able to experience everything fully so that there will be that end of the tunnel, as you mentioned before. I appreciate you joining me today.
Thank you, Scott. It is a joy to talk to you. You know, it says "Daga b'lev ish yisachena." Like when you have a worry in your heart, the rabbis in Yoma say, talk it through. Pick the people who you have the conversation that you need to have, because they're wonderful listeners and they ask wonderful questions, and you're certainly one of those people. I just want to say, post-election, here in the United States, I wrote a quick post on Facebook. I had a lot of very complex emotions, and I wrote, "Today I am unleashing fierce love into the world. Who's joining me?" And there are many wonderful responses, but I just want to put that out there. Right? What does it mean to wake up and say, "I am unleashing fierce love into the world"? Please join me.
Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. I hope you'll become a Jewish Coffee House patron on Patreon. Just click on the link in the description of this podcast, and you can get bonus episodes, Jewish Coffee House merch, and more. You'll get special episodes on all sorts of topics that are only available to subscribers, and you'll be helping Jewish Coffee House spread our message of a welcoming, intellectually engaged, and honest Orthodoxy. Just join Patreon. It's only a couple of dollars a month, and you can stop anytime, so join today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.